The quiet man at the diner. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Miller's Diner, a popular breakfast spot just outside Fort Benning. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the air as early customers made their way inside. Among them was an older man, walking with a slight limp that suggested old injuries. His name was Robert Bobby Chen, and at 62 he carried himself with quiet dignity despite the worn clothes and weathered hands that spoke of hard times. Bobby had been coming to Miller's Diner every Tuesday morning for the past 6 months, ever since he'd moved to Columbus, Georgia. He always sat at the same corner booth, ordered the same thing, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee, and kept to himself. The waitress, Maria, had grown fond of the polite man who always said, "Please and thank you," left a decent tip despite clearly watching every dollar, and never caused any trouble. This particular Tuesday started like any other, but it would end differently than Bobby could have imagined. As he settled into his usual booth with his newspaper and coffee, the diner's bell chimed, and in walked a group of 5 young soldiers. Their fresh uniforms, confident swagger, and the distinctive tan berets tucked under their arms immediately identified them as Army Rangers from the nearby base. The Rangers were clearly celebrating something. Their voices carried across the small diner as they talked excitedly about completing their latest training exercise. They were young, fit, and full of the pride that comes with being part of one of the military's most elite units. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, the apparent leader of the group, was regaling his teammates with stories from their recent mission simulation, his voice growing louder with each tale. As they waited for their table, one of the younger Rangers, Private First Class Danny Walsh, noticed Bobby sitting alone in the corner. Something about the older man's appearance seemed to amuse him. Maybe it was the faded jacket Bobby wore, or the way he carefully counted out exact change for his coffee refill, or perhaps it was simply the boredom of a young soldier looking for entertainment. "Hey, look at that old guy over there," Danny whispered to his buddies, nodding toward Bobby's booth. "Bet he's one of those wannabe veterans who hangs around military towns pretending he served." His comment drew snickers from a couple of the other Rangers. Staff Sergeant Torres glanced over at Bobby, then back at his men. While he didn't encourage the mocking, he didn't stop it either. The Rangers had just completed one of their toughest training cycles, and he was inclined to let them blow off some steam. "Probably tells war stories at the VFW about his imaginary service," added Specialist Rick Martinez, grinning at his own joke. "Look at him. Can barely walk straight. Real soldiers don't end up like that." The comments continued as the Rangers were seated at a large table near Bobby's booth. Their voices weren't exactly quiet, and several other diners began to notice the uncomfortable situation developing. Bobby, however, seemed oblivious to their remarks. He continued reading his newspaper, occasionally taking sips of his coffee, showing no outward sign that he could hear what was being said about him. But Bobby could hear every word. His military training from decades past had taught him to be aware of his surroundings at all times, and the skills learned in the jungles of Southeast Asia didn't simply disappear with age. He chose not to react, not out of fear or shame, but because he understood something these young Rangers had yet to learn, that true strength often lies in restraint. Maria, the waitress, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. She had served Bobby for months and had noticed small things about him that others might miss. The way he instinctively scanned the room when he entered, the precise way he folded his napkin, the fact that he always sat with his back to the wall facing the door. These weren't the habits of someone pretending to be a veteran. As the Rangers' breakfast arrived, their conversation grew more animated. They began sharing stories of their training, each trying to outdo the others with tales of endurance and skill. The discussion inevitably turned to what they perceived as the decline of previous generations of soldiers. "Back in the day, they had it easy," claimed Private Walsh, gesturing with his fork. "No real combat, just sitting in bases drinking beer. Not like what we do now." His statement drew approving nods from his younger companions, though Staff Sergeant Torres remained quiet, something nagging at him about the situation. Specialist Martinez decided to escalate things further. Standing up from his chair, he walked over toward Bobby's booth, ostensibly to use the restroom, but made sure to pass close enough to make his presence known. "Excuse me, sir," Martinez said with exaggerated politeness. "My friends and I were wondering about your military service. We're always interested in hearing from other veterans." The way he emphasized the word veterans made it clear he was being sarcastic. Bobby looked up from his newspaper for the first time since the Rangers had entered. His eyes were calm, alert, and showed no sign of intimidation. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "I served," Bobby said simply, then returned to his newspaper. Martinez wasn't satisfied with this response. "Oh, really? What unit? When? Where did you serve?" The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to trip up someone who might be lying about military service. "That was a long time ago," Bobby replied, still not looking up from his paper. "I don't talk much about it." This response only served to convince Martinez and his watching teammates that they had indeed found someone pretending to be a veteran. In their experience, real soldiers were proud to talk about their service, eager to share stories and compare experiences. Bobby's reluctance seemed like proof of deception. "Come on, old-timer," Private Walsh called out from his table, emboldened by his friend's seeming success. "If you really served, you'd remember. What was your MOS? What years? Which war?" The questions were asked with obvious skepticism. Other diners were now openly staring at the confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed curious about how it would unfold. Maria approached Bobby's table with the coffee pot, using the excuse of a refill to check on her customer. "You doing okay, Mr. Chen?" she asked quietly, using the name she'd learned from his credit card. Bobby nodded to her with a small smile. "I'm fine, thank you, Maria. Just finishing up here." But the Rangers weren't ready to let the matter drop. Staff Sergeant Torres finally spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. "Look, sir, my men are just curious. We see a lot of people around here who claim military service when they never actually served. It's disrespectful to those of us who actually put our lives on the line." For the first time, Bobby closed his newspaper and looked directly at the table of Rangers. His gaze was steady, measuring, the look of someone who had faced much more serious confrontations than this. When he spoke, his voice remained calm, but there was something in his tone that made the diner grow quiet. "Young man," Bobby said to Staff Sergeant Torres, "I understand your concern about people misrepresenting their service. That is indeed disrespectful to those who served honorably." He paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee before continuing. "But perhaps you might consider that some veterans choose not to discuss their experiences, not because they have something to hide, but because they have something to remember." The simple dignity in Bobby's response caught Staff Sergeant Torres off guard. There was something about the older man's bearing, the way he held himself, that suggested military training. But his younger soldiers were not yet experienced enough to recognize these subtle signs. "That's convenient," muttered Private Walsh under his breath, though loud enough for Bobby to hear. "Can't prove you served if you won't talk about it." Bobby stood up slowly, his movement deliberate despite his obvious physical limitations. He reached into his wallet and pulled out enough money to cover his bill and tip, placing it carefully on the table. As he prepared to leave, he turned to address the Rangers one final time. "I hope you young men have long, successful careers in the Army," he said sincerely. "The Rangers have always been an elite unit, and I'm sure you'll uphold that tradition." He picked up his jacket from the booth. "But remember, the measure of a soldier isn't just in what he can do on the battlefield. It's in how he treats others when the fighting is done." With that, Bobby headed toward the door, his limp more pronounced now that he was walking a longer distance. The Rangers watched him go, some still smirking, others beginning to feel less certain about what had just transpired. Staff Sergeant Torres found himself studying the older man's gait more carefully, noting details he had missed before. As Bobby reached the door, Maria called out, "See you next Tuesday, Mr. Chen." Bobby turned and gave her a genuine smile. "Wouldn't miss it, Maria. Thank you for always taking good care of me." The diner remained unusually quiet for several minutes after Bobby left. The Rangers finished their breakfast with less enthusiasm than before, their conversation more subdued. Staff Sergeant Torres couldn't shake the feeling that they had just made a significant mistake, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was. Outside, Bobby walked slowly to his old pickup truck, taking his time despite the obvious discomfort in his leg. He didn't look back at the diner or show any sign of anger about what had transpired. If anything, his expression was one of sadness, not for himself, but for the young soldiers who had so much to learn about honor, respect, and the true cost of service. As he drove away, Bobby's mind drifted back to places and times he rarely allowed himself to remember. Memories of friends who never came home, of missions that remained classified decades later, of a different kind of war fought by different rules. He had long ago made peace with the decision to keep those experiences private, understanding that some stories were too important to be shared casually, and some sacrifices too profound to be used for personal validation. The Rangers at Miller's Diner had no way of knowing that they had just dismissed one of the most decorated veterans in their town, a man whose service record contained commendations and classifications that might surprise even their commanding officers. But they were about to learn that respect, once lost through hasty judgment, can be much harder to regain than it was to give in the first place. The discovery 3 days had passed since the incident at Miller's Diner, but Staff Sergeant Mike Torres couldn't get the encounter out of his mind. Something about the older man's response had bothered him, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. The way Bobby had carried himself, the measured tone of his voice, the specific way he had spoken about the Rangers. It all suggested familiarity with military culture that went beyond casual observation. That Friday afternoon, Torres found himself at the base library, ostensibly working on reports but actually thinking about Tuesday morning's events. His conscience was troubling him more with each passing day. While he hadn't directly participated in mocking the elderly veteran, he had allowed his subordinates to do so, and leadership meant taking responsibility for the actions of those under his command. Private First Class Danny Walsh had been telling and retelling the story of the fake veteran to anyone who would listen, each version becoming more embellished than the last. According to Walsh's latest account, the old man had practically run from the diner when confronted about his supposed military service. The story was beginning to spread beyond their immediate unit, and Torres was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the narrative. It was specialist Rick Martinez who inadvertently set the next chain of events in motion. While getting his hair cut at the base barbershop, Martinez mentioned the incident to Tony Guerrero, a veteran barber who had been cutting military hair for over 30 years. Tony had connections throughout the local veteran community and knew most of the older former servicemen in the area. "You said his name was Chen?" Tony asked, his scissors pausing mid-cut. "Asian guy, maybe early 60s, walks with a limp?" "Yeah, that's him," Martinez replied. "Why, you know him?" Tony's expression grew serious. "Son, you might want to be real careful about who you're calling a fake veteran. Bobby Chen is about as real as they come." The barber set down his scissors and looked Martinez directly in the eye. "That man has more combat decorations than most people have teeth." Martinez felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Robert Chen is a Medal of Honor recipient," Tony said quietly. "Vietnam War. Special operations. The kind of stuff that's still classified 40 years later." He picked up his scissors again, but didn't resume cutting. He doesn't talk about it because he can't talk about most of it, and what he can talk about, he chooses not to. Some experiences are too heavy to share with strangers. The color drained from Martinez's face as the full implications of Tony's words hit him. A Medal of Honor recipient. The highest military decoration in the United States. And they had accused him of being a fake veteran, mocked him in public, treated him with contempt and disrespect. "Are you absolutely sure?" Martinez asked, hoping against hope that the barber was mistaken. Tony walked over to a wall covered with photographs of local veterans. Among them was a picture that made Martinez's blood run cold. It showed a much younger Bobby Chen in dress uniform, wearing the distinctive blue ribbon and star-shaped medal that could only be the Medal of Honor. The photograph was signed and dated, clearly authentic, and accompanied by a brief description of Chen's service with a Special Forces unit in Vietnam. "Dead certain," Tony said, returning to his station. "The Veterans Administration has his picture right there on their wall of local Medal of Honor recipients. Has for years." He resumed cutting Martinez's hair, but his movements were sharp, reflecting his displeasure. "Bobby Chen ran classified missions behind enemy lines for 3 years. Lost half his unit on his last operation, the one that earned him the Medal of Honor. Saved 12 American POWs and held off an entire North Vietnamese company with just 3 other guys until extraction arrived." Martinez sat in stunned silence as Tony continued. "After the war, he had a good career, raised a family, never made a big deal about his service. His wife died couple years back, kids live in other states. Social Security doesn't stretch as far as it used to, so he lives modestly. But that man has more honor in his little finger than most people accumulate in a lifetime." When Martinez returned to base, he was visibly shaken. His teammates initially assumed he was coming down with something, but when he finally told them what he had learned, the mood in their barracks changed dramatically. The realization that they had publicly humiliated a genuine American hero, a Medal of Honor recipient, was almost too much to bear. Private Walsh, who had been the most vocal in his mockery of Bobby, became physically ill when he heard the truth. The thought that his disrespectful behavior had been directed at someone who had literally risked everything for his country was overwhelming. He had grown up hearing stories about Medal of Honor recipients, viewing them as legendary figures, almost mythical in their heroism. Staff Sergeant Torres felt the weight of leadership responsibility crushing down on him. He should have recognized the signs, should have stopped his men from their disrespectful behavior, should have known better than to judge a man so quickly. The incident had revealed a failure of leadership that could have serious consequences for his career, but more importantly, it had revealed a failure of character that he would have to live with. The news spread quickly through their unit and beyond. Other soldiers who knew Bobby Chen began coming forward with their own stories. A sergeant from the motor pool mentioned that Bobby had helped his family when they were going through financial difficulties, quietly paying for groceries and never expecting recognition. A military police officer recalled Bobby visiting wounded soldiers at the VA hospital, spending time with men who had no family nearby. Slowly, a picture emerged of a man who embodied the best qualities of military service long after his official duty had ended. Bobby Chen wasn't just a decorated war hero. He was a person who continued to serve his community and fellow veterans in quiet, meaningful ways. His reluctance to discuss his military service wasn't about shame or deception. It was about humility and the understanding that true heroism doesn't need constant validation. The Rangers learned that Bobby's limp came from injuries sustained during his Medal of Honor action, when shrapnel from a mortar explosion had damaged his left leg. He had refused medical evacuation until all the rescued POWs were safely extracted, continuing to fight despite his wounds. The injury had ended his military career, but not his dedication to serving others. As word of their mistake spread, The Rangers found themselves facing something they had never experienced before, the disappointment and judgment of their peers. Other soldiers looked at them differently. Conversations stopped when they entered rooms, and their reputation within the base community began to suffer. They had not only disrespected a war hero, they had done so publicly, in front of civilians, reflecting poorly on the entire military. Colonel James Harrison, their battalion commander, learned about the incident through unofficial channels before any formal report reached his desk. A Vietnam veteran himself, Harrison was personally acquainted with Bobby Chen's service record and was appalled to learn that Rangers under his command had treated such a distinguished veteran with disrespect. Harrison called Staff Sergeant Torres to his office on Monday morning. The meeting was brief but intense. Without raising his voice, the colonel made it clear that the incident represented a failure of leadership, judgment, and basic human decency that could not be overlooked. While no formal disciplinary action would be taken immediately, Torres and his team would be required to make things right. "Sergeant Torres," Colonel Harrison said as the meeting concluded, "the Ranger Creed speaks of never leaving a fallen comrade. It seems to me that your team has forgotten that Robert Chen is still our comrade, regardless of when he served. That needs to be corrected, and it needs to be corrected soon." Torres left the colonel's office knowing exactly what he had to do. The question wasn't whether they would apologize to Bobby Chen. That was non-negotiable. The question was how to do it in a way that showed genuine remorse and respect, not just an attempt to avoid further consequences. That evening, Torres gathered his team to plan their approach. The atmosphere was somber, far different from the confident swagger they had displayed just days earlier. They were no longer young soldiers full of pride about their elite status. They were men who had learned a hard lesson about the difference between earning respect and deserving it. Private Walsh spoke up first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sergeant, I don't know how we make this right. How do you apologize to a Medal of Honor recipient for calling him a fake? How do you take back that kind of disrespect?" Torres looked at each of his men in turn. "We start by being honest about what we did wrong, and then we spend however long it takes proving that we learned something from this mistake." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But first, we need to find Mr. Chen and give him the respect he should have received from the beginning." The team agreed that they would return to Miller's Diner the following Tuesday, hoping to find Bobby at his usual table. They would approach him not as soldiers demanding recognition, but as men asking for forgiveness. What they didn't know was that Bobby Chen had already heard about their discovery of his service record, and he was prepared for their visit with a grace and wisdom that would teach them even more about what it truly meant to serve with honor. The Reckoning and Redemption. Tuesday morning arrived with an unusual tension in the air at Fort Benning. Word about the Rangers' encounter with Medal of Honor recipient Robert Chen had spread throughout the base, creating a buzz of conversation that reached all the way to the commanding general's office. For Staff Sergeant Torres and his team, the day represented their chance at redemption, or the possibility of making an already difficult situation much worse. They arrived at Miller's Diner 30 minutes before Bobby's usual time, wanting to ensure they wouldn't miss him. The waitress, Maria, recognized them immediately, and her expression turned cold. She had learned about Bobby's service record from other customers and was not pleased to see the soldiers who had treated her favorite customer so poorly. "You here to cause more trouble?" Maria asked bluntly, as they requested a table near Bobby's usual booth. "No, ma'am," Torres replied respectfully. "We're here to apologize. We made a terrible mistake last week, and we need to make it right." Maria studied the young soldiers for a moment, noting their subdued demeanor and obvious nervousness. "Mr. Chen is a good man," she said finally. "He doesn't deserve what you put him through." "You're absolutely right," Private Walsh interjected, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "We know that now, and we're here to tell him so." At exactly 8:15, Bobby Chen entered the diner, moving with his characteristic deliberate pace. He noticed the Rangers immediately but showed no surprise at their presence. Word travels fast in military communities, and he had already heard about their discovery of his service record. He approached his usual booth calmly, nodding politely to Maria as she brought his coffee without being asked. Torres stood up slowly, his heart pounding as he approached Bobby's table. The other Rangers remained seated but watched anxiously as their leader prepared to face the consequences of their actions. "Mr. Chen," Torres began, his voice respectful but clearly nervous. "I'm Staff Sergeant Torres. Last week, my men and I treated you with disrespect, and I've come to apologize." Bobby looked up from his menu, his expression calm and measured. "Staff Sergeant," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Please, sit down." Torres took the seat across from Bobby, acutely aware that other diners were watching the interaction with interest. "Sir, we learned about your Medal of Honor, about your service in Vietnam, about everything we should have known before we opened our mouths. There's no excuse for how we treated you." "And how exactly did you treat me?" Bobby asked quietly, though they both knew he was testing whether Torres would be fully honest about what had occurred. Torres swallowed hard before responding. "We mocked you, sir. We assumed you were lying about your military service. We were disrespectful, judgmental, and completely out of line. We acted like the worst kind of soldiers, the kind who think their current service gives them the right to disrespect those who served before us." Bobby sipped his coffee slowly, letting Torres's words hang in the air. "And what makes you think I want your apology, Sergeant?" The question caught Torres off guard. He had expected Bobby to either accept their apology graciously or reject it angrily. He hadn't considered that the Medal of Honor recipient might challenge the very premise of their approach. Honestly, sir, I don't know if you want our apology," Torres admitted. "But we owe it to you regardless. What we did was wrong, and as soldiers we need to take responsibility for our actions." For the first time since Torres had sat down, Bobby smiled slightly. "Now that's a better answer, Sergeant. Sit back and relax. You look like you're about to face a firing squad." Torres felt some of the tension leave his shoulders as he settled into his chair. "Sir, with respect, facing a firing squad might be easier than this conversation." Bobby's smile widened. "Young man, I've faced actual firing squads. Trust me when I say this conversation is significantly more pleasant." His tone was light, but the reminder of his combat experience added weight to his words. "Mr. Chen," Torres continued, "I need you to know that this wasn't just my failure. It was a failure of leadership. I should have stopped my men from making assumptions, from treating you disrespectfully, from behaving in a way that dishonored the uniform they wear." "Tell me, Sergeant," Bobby said, leaning back in his booth. "What did you learn from this experience?" Torres considered the question carefully before responding. "We learned that respect isn't something you earn just by wearing a uniform or completing training. We learned that every veteran deserves dignity, regardless of when they served or what they look like now. We learned that some of the most heroic people you'll ever meet are the ones who never talk about their heroism." "And what else?" Bobby prompted. "We learned that real strength sometimes means keeping quiet, that there's wisdom in humility, and that just because someone doesn't look like our idea of a hero doesn't mean they aren't one." Torres paused, gathering courage for his next words. "And we learned that we still have a lot to learn about being the kind of soldiers our country deserves." Bobby nodded approvingly. "Those are valuable lessons, Sergeant. The question is whether you'll remember them next week, next month, next year, when you encounter someone else who doesn't fit your expectations." At this point, Private Walsh stood up from his table and approached Bobby's booth. His face was pale, and his hands were visibly shaking. "Mr. Chen, sir, I was the worst one last week. I made jokes. I questioned your service. I was completely out of line. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you face to face that I'm sorry." Bobby studied the young soldier for a moment. Walsh couldn't have been more than 22 years old, barely old enough to understand the weight of the uniform he wore. "Son, what's your name?" "Private First Class Daniel Walsh, sir." "Danny. Danny, let me ask you something. When you joined the Rangers, what did you think you were signing up for?" Walsh shifted uncomfortably. "To be part of the best, sir. To serve my country at the highest level." "And do you think mocking elderly veterans in restaurants is part of serving at the highest level?" "No, sir, absolutely not. I was wrong, and I'm ashamed of how I behaved." Bobby gestured for Walsh to sit down next to Torres. "Danny, the Rangers have a long and proud history. Do you know who some of the first Rangers were?" "World War II, sir. They fought at Normandy, in Europe." "That's right. And many of those men came home to face a country that didn't always appreciate their service. Some struggled with injuries, some with what we now call PTSD, some with just adapting to civilian life. Some of them ended up looking exactly like me. Older, worn down by life, not fitting anyone's image of a war hero." Walsh listened intently as Bobby continued. "The measure of a Ranger isn't just what he does in combat. It's how he treats his fellow soldiers, his fellow veterans, his fellow human beings every single day. That's what the creed means when it talks about never leaving a fallen comrade. It doesn't just apply on the battlefield." By now, Specialist Martinez and the other Rangers had joined the conversation at Bobby's booth. The corner of the diner had become an impromptu classroom where a Medal of Honor recipient was teaching a master class in military values to some of the Army's elite soldiers. "Mr. Chen," Martinez spoke up, "how do we make this right? How do we earn back the respect we lost?" Bobby looked around the table at the 5 young faces, each showing genuine remorse and a desire to do better. "You don't earn it back by talking, son. You earn it back by living it. By treating every veteran, every person you encounter, with the dignity they deserve. By remembering that the uniform doesn't make you special. How you wear it does." The conversation continued for another hour, with Bobby sharing stories not about his combat actions, but about the values that had guided him through military service and civilian life. He spoke about the importance of humility, the strength found in admitting mistakes, and the responsibility that comes with being part of something larger than yourself. As the discussion was winding down, Colonel Harrison entered the diner. He had heard about the meeting through the military grapevine and decided to witness the resolution personally. Bobby recognized him immediately, having met the colonel at various military functions over the years. "Colonel Harrison," Bobby said, standing slowly to shake hands. "I should have known you'd show up sooner or later." "Mr. Chen," Harrison replied respectfully, "I came to personally apologize for the behavior of soldiers under my command. This kind of disrespect is unacceptable, and it won't happen again." "Actually, Colonel," Bobby said with a smile, "I think your soldiers have learned something valuable from this experience. Sometimes the best education comes from making mistakes and having the courage to correct them." Harrison looked at his Rangers, noting their subdued but attentive postures. "Is that your assessment, Mr. Chen?" "It is," Bobby confirmed. "These are good soldiers who made a bad mistake. They've shown the character to admit they were wrong and the wisdom to learn from the experience. That's more than many people ever manage." Colonel Harrison nodded, then addressed his soldiers directly. "Staff Sergeant Torres, you and your team will report to my office at 1400 hours. We need to discuss how this experience will be incorporated into our unit's training program on military values and respect for veterans." The Rangers acknowledged the order, understanding that while they had been forgiven by Bobby Chen, their military leadership would ensure they used this experience to educate others. As the group prepared to leave, Bobby stood and extended his hand to each Ranger in turn. "Gentlemen, it's been an honor talking with you today. I hope our paths cross again under better circumstances. Private Walsh, fighting back tears, shook Bobby's hand firmly. "Mr. Chen, sir, thank you for teaching us what being a real soldier means. I promise I'll never forget this lesson." "I'm counting on that, Danny," Bobby replied with a warm smile. As the soldiers filed out of the diner, Colonel Harrison lingered for a moment. "Mr. Chen, thank you for handling this with such grace. A lesser man might have demanded formal discipline or public humiliation for these soldiers." Bobby shook his head. "Colonel, those young men are going to spend the rest of their military careers treating veterans with the respect they deserve. They're going to teach other soldiers what they learned here today. Sometimes the best punishment is understanding the weight of your actions and choosing to do better." The story of the encounter at Miller's Diner spread throughout Fort Benning and beyond, becoming a powerful teaching tool about respect, humility, and the true meaning of military service. The Rangers, who had once mocked Bobby Chen, became some of the most vocal advocates for veteran affairs on their base, organizing volunteer activities and ensuring that older veterans in their community received the recognition and support they deserved. Years later, when each of those Rangers reached leadership positions themselves, they would tell the story of Bobby Chen to their own subordinates, passing on the lesson that true strength lies not in physical prowess or elite training, but in the character to treat every person with dignity and respect. And in a small corner booth at Miller's Diner, a Medal of Honor recipient continued his weekly routine. Confident that he had helped shape a new generation of soldiers who understood that service to country extends far beyond the battlefield.